Every morning, a crow left human teeth on a woman's balcony. When she decided to follow the bird, she discovered a hidden cave with a horrifying secret that shocked even the police. Subscribe and let us know in the comments where you're watching this video from. Melissa Harper had never imagined that her life, once filled with the predictable routines of a dental clinic, would one day shrink to the quiet walls of a modest apartment on the outskirts of town. She had always believed she would retire gracefully at 70, fully satisfied with her career, watching her patients grow older alongside her. But fate had intervened far earlier than she expected. A year ago, her heart had begun to fail her. The doctors insisted that stress and age had taken their toll, and after a dangerous emergency surgery that left a thin scar beneath her left breast, Melissa was forced to step away from her profession for the sake of survival. Now, just past 55, she was a doctor without a clinic, a caregiver without patience, a woman whose hands still remembered the gentleness required to restore a smile, but whose days held no one to help. The first weeks of her retirement were the hardest. Friends tried to convince her that she had earned the rest, that she should enjoy the peace. But peace felt too much like silence, and silence felt too much like loneliness. With no family left except memories of a brother who had died years earlier in a car accident, Melissa's world had grown small. Her apartment was comfortable but plain. One bedroom, one living room, and a narrow balcony overlooking a cluster of trees that bordered the large state forest nearby. The trees were what she liked most. They pulled her attention away from the ache in her chest and reminded her that life continued to breathe just beyond the railing. Each morning, she opened the balcony door, letting fresh air flow into her living space, and sprinkled a handful of seeds or crumbs on the edge of the metal banister. Soon, birds became her daily visitors. Finches, sparrows, the occasional blue jay, and one glossy black crow who seemed to arrive with more purpose than the rest. The crow showed up every morning, sometimes before the sun fully crested the horizon. It perched on the railing as though it owned the place, tilting its head and watching Melissa with an intelligence she had only ever seen in the brightest of her patients' eyes. She jokingly named the bird Raven, though she had no idea whether it was male or female. The name simply felt right. Raven wasn't afraid of her, and as days became weeks, it would hop a little closer each time she extended her hand. Eventually, it dared to take small pieces of bread directly from her palm, its claws light against her skin, its feathers smooth like polished ink. Melissa found comfort in Raven's presence. In a strange way, she felt less alone knowing there was one creature who expected her each morning. Feeding the birds became her new schedule. It helped her remember there was still value in her days, even if it wasn't the kind she once knew. That morning, like so many before it, Raven arrived just as Melissa was finishing her tea. The sun was faint, a pale disk behind thin clouds, and the breeze smelled of damp leaves. Melissa smiled when she saw the bird swoop down from a high branch and land. But something was different this time. Raven wasn't empty-beaked. It dropped something small and pale onto the railing with a delicate clink before hopping back and watching her curiously. "What have you brought now?" she murmured, expecting perhaps a pebble or a piece of trash. Birds had a habit of mistaking shiny objects for treasure. She leaned in, squinting. The object was white, roughly the size of a fingernail, with a shape that made her breath hitch sharply in her chest. Her mind recognized it before her heart could catch up. It was a tooth. Her heart stuttered, not with the physical defect she'd come to fear, but with a rush of dread she hadn't expected to feel ever again. Carefully, she picked it up using the corner of her shirt to avoid touching it directly. The tooth was intact, a molar with a silver-colored amalgam filling embedded deep into the chewing surface. The enamel was slightly worn, suggesting an adult, perhaps middle-aged. She rotated it under the morning light, inspecting the root. It hadn't been surgically removed. It looked as though it had been pulled out with force. She felt a chill begin at the base of her spine and crawl upward. This wasn't the kind of item a crow should ever have access to. She glanced at Raven. The bird blinked back, completely relaxed, as though this were just another crumb or seed. Melissa's professional instincts surged, unearthing long-buried reflexes. She carried the tooth inside, set it on a folded napkin, and fetched a small magnifying lens she sometimes used for reading fine print. Under the lens, the details sharpened. The contour of the filling, the ridges of chewing wear, faint traces of tissue still clinging to the root. Her stomach churned. It had not been exposed to soil long enough to discolor. Recent, too recent. She sat down heavily, gripping the edges of the table. Memories flashed in her mind. Years of anxious patience, gentle reassurances, the sound of suction tubes, and the scent of disinfectant. The world of dentistry was one she trusted, understood. Teeth did not lie. Teeth carried stories, age, health, socioeconomic background, even trauma. And this tooth story was one of violence or improper handling. She stared at the balcony as Raven let out a low caw before spreading its wings and flying away, vanishing into the trees. Melissa tried to convince herself that there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe there was a medical school nearby disposing of superficial remains. Maybe construction had unearthed old graves. Maybe someone lost their veneer in some bizarre accident. But the filling looked modern. Too modern for an archaeological relic. Too recent for discarded training material. She told herself to calm down, to avoid spiraling into paranoia. She cleaned the tooth gently with water, placed it into a small plastic container she once used for prescription pills, and sealed it shut. Perhaps she would take it to someone later, maybe the police if another clue surfaced. For the rest of the day, she found herself returning to the container again and again, needing to confirm that she hadn't imagined any of it. Each time, the truth waited patiently inside the clear plastic. That night, Melissa slept poorly. Each creak of the building made her eyes open. Each shadow in the hallway looked unfamiliar. She tried to reassure herself there was nothing threatening about one tooth, but her mind disobeyed. It whispered what professionals learned early in their medical training: where there is one, there are more. Morning crept in too soon, pale and cold. Melissa moved slowly, exhausted. The moment she opened the balcony door, a harsh black silhouette appeared against the dim sky and descended toward her with familiar precision. Raven landed again and dropped a second tooth. This time, Melissa did not breathe for several seconds. She stared at the new object, knowing without touching that it was human. Her fingers trembled as she reached out. It was a premolar this time with a composite resin filling. Newer material. A different style from the first. A different person. She felt a pressure behind her eyes, the kind that grew just before tears or a headache, but neither came. Instead, she felt a blooming sense of dread, spreading slow and deliberate through her chest. She placed the second tooth into a separate, small container and stood there motionless, listening to the quiet chirps of distant birds and the soft rustle of leaves. Raven lingered a moment, tilting its head as though expecting praise or reward. Melissa only stared. Eventually, Raven flew off again, disappearing into the greenery that now seemed less like nature and more like a curtain hiding an unknown horror. Melissa closed the door and locked it, though she knew it was a futile gesture. Her danger was not outside trying to get in. It was out there, somewhere, in the forest where Raven traveled so freely each morning. She glanced toward her cabinet filled with the mementos of her old life. Framed certificates, models of jaws, X-ray viewers still plugged though unused. She had always found comfort in knowing teeth were honest. They told the truth even when people lied. Right now, they were telling her something she did not want to know. She moved through the rest of her morning in a haze. Tea had no taste. The news on television sounded muffled and irrelevant. Every so often she checked the window, half hoping Raven would return with something normal. A twig, a wrapper, anything that would make the teeth seem like a strange coincidence. But coincidence had never dropped a filled molar onto her balcony before breakfast. As afternoon approached, Melissa placed both containers inside her desk drawer, as though hiding them could silence the implications they carried. But hiding didn't help. Her thoughts returned again and again to the same questions. Where had Raven found the teeth? Who do they belong to? Were they from a grave, or something far worse? And why was the crow bringing them to her? When night arrived once more and Melissa lay in the darkness of her quiet apartment, she tried to control the storm inside her. She told herself she was overreacting, that she must wait for more evidence before letting panic take hold. But beneath the layers of logic and restraint, a cold truth waited. Raven had changed everything. Somewhere in the dense forest beyond her balcony, a secret existed. It was gruesome and wrong and closer than anyone in town seemed to know. The crow was a messenger, delivering pieces of the truth, one small white fragment at a time. Melissa realized that the life she thought would be simple and quiet would not remain so for long. A door to the unknown had cracked open, and whether she wanted to or not, she was already stepping through it. When she finally drifted into uneasy sleep, she dreamed of Raven perched on a branch high above her, watching with unblinking eyes, its beak opening slowly to release a shower of glimmering teeth that rained down like hailstones, bouncing off the ground with tiny metallic clicks. In the dream, Melissa tried to gather them in her hands, but the more she picked up, the more fell. Around her, the forest loomed dark and endless, swallowing the sound of her breath. She awoke just before dawn, covered in cold sweat, knowing something with absolute certainty. This was only the beginning. The next morning arrived like a weight placed upon Melissa's chest rather than the gentle comfort of a new day. She woke before the alarm she no longer needed, her pulse fast and uneven, her mind already caught in a net of fearful anticipation. The memory of yesterday's discoveries had not lightened overnight. If anything, the darkness had sharpened them, given them edges that pricked at her every thought. She sat on the edge of her bed, hands pressed against her knees to steady the tremble she could feel building inside her. There had been 2 teeth now. 2. Enough to eliminate any possibility that Raven's deliveries were just the unfortunate remnants of discarded dental work. Something was wrong. Something was deeply, disturbingly wrong. With slow, reluctant steps, she made her way toward the balcony, pausing long enough in the kitchen to pour herself a cup of tea that she had no intention of drinking. She set the mug down and stared at the balcony door as though her gaze alone might keep whatever horror waited there from entering. She tried to convince herself that if she simply avoided opening that door, the chain of events would break and the nightmare would dissolve. But ignoring a truth did not erase it. She had learned that after her brother's death. Pretending he might walk back through the door never made it happen. Finally, she inhaled, the air sharp in her lungs, and unlocked the door. The cold morning breeze swept in as she stepped out onto the small space. Her eyes moved instantly toward the railing. Raven was already there. This time, Melissa flinched before the crow even opened its beak. She felt like a character in a book she didn't want to read anymore, yet she couldn't stop turning the pages. Raven released another prize onto the railing, landed lightly, and hopped back with a satisfied ruffle of feathers. Melissa stared at the object, needing several seconds to gather the courage to pick it up. Another tooth, a different shape again. A premolar, but not the same as the second. She sealed it away inside a third pill container, her hands clumsy with fear. Her stomach fluttered with nausea so strong she had to grip the back of a chair to steady herself. Raven seemed puzzled by her lack of reaction, cawing once as if to ask why she was not grateful for the gift. "I can't do this," she whispered to no one. The walls of her apartment didn't care what she could or could not endure. The birds outside certainly didn't. But her own conscience did. She was, by training, someone who noticed the details others chose to overlook. Ignoring evidence, that was a betrayal of everything she had once lived for. But knowing that didn't make the situation any easier. Raven flapped away into the canopy of trees, its silhouette disappearing among the towering trunks. Melissa retreated inside, her heart hammering like a fist on a locked door. The 3 containers now sat in a row on her kitchen table, like silent markers of a crime she feared was unfolding just beyond the boundary of normal life. She didn't want to look at them anymore, yet she kept glancing back as if they might vanish if she didn't keep watch. Her medical experience surged, unwilling to remain dormant in the presence of such evidence. She retrieved her magnifying lens and a small flashlight, the old habits of inspection and analysis resurfacing despite her trembling nerves. The third tooth, like the others, bore signs of having come from a living mouth not long before its removal. The root was intact, and faint residue along the base suggested soft tissue had been attached recently. There were no cracks of age or erosion consistent with burial. Somewhere, recently, this tooth had belonged to a person who could feel pain. She closed her eyes and willed herself to breathe. There were countless stories in the news, missing people, unsolved disappearances, but they had always felt distant. Tragedies that happened to strangers in other towns, other states. Now, those tragedies felt close enough to touch, close enough to be delivered directly into her home by a bird she had once found comforting. She needed help. That truth settled heavily on her shoulders. As much as she disliked the idea of being dismissed again, she knew she couldn't be alone with this knowledge any longer. She grabbed her coat, tucked the containers carefully into her purse, and headed toward the police station. The building was as dull and utilitarian as every other civic structure in town. She stood in the lobby for a moment, steeling herself before approaching the front desk. The officer on duty was a young man with tired eyes that scanned her the way someone checks for trouble before engaging. Melissa explained, calmly at first, that she had found something disturbing. Teeth, more than one, and possibly human. The officer tried to mask the skepticism that flickered across his face, but Melissa had spent a lifetime reading subtle cues. He nodded, typed a few notes into a computer, asked if she was certain they were human. Yes, she said. She was certain. She had been a dentist for 30 years. She knew a human tooth when she saw one. When he asked how she had come across them, her answer, delivered by a crow, landed with a weight that nearly crushed the credibility of her claim. She could feel him withdrawing mentally, filing her under eccentric elderly resident with too much time. Even when she showed him the containers, he merely glanced briefly, not with the intensity of someone recognizing evidence of a crime, but with the polite smile of someone humoring an anxious woman. He promised, in a tone that promised very little, to log the teeth and have someone take a look into it. But his eyes betrayed his belief that there was nothing worth pursuing. As she left the station, Melissa's face burned with humiliation and frustration, her footsteps echoing too loudly in the sterile hallway. It felt as though she had reached out for help, only to find that her hand passed through smoke. Outside, she leaned against a cold brick wall and closed her eyes. She had done the reasonable thing, the responsible thing. And it hadn't been enough. If the police weren't going to help, she would have to find another way. She trudged home through the crisp air, the sound of her shoes crunching against fallen leaves. The forest loomed in the distance, a quiet menace pressing at the edge of town. She could feel it calling to her now, as though it held answers waiting just beyond the visible. All day, she watched the trees from her window, waiting for Raven. She tried to distract herself with books and chores, but her mind circled the same thoughts like a vulture around a carcass. By late afternoon, shadows had begun to stretch, and she found herself sitting by the balcony door without remembering how she got there. When Raven returned once more, hands trembling, she didn't even look at the item the bird dropped. Her eyes were fixed on Raven itself, on the intelligence burning behind its dark gaze. The crow cocked its head, feathers glinting in the fading light, and Melissa had the sudden, irrational sense that the bird expected her to understand something, as if it were urging her onward. The evidence was no longer sporadic, no longer ignorable. If she continued to wait, more teeth would come, each one another fragment of a nightmare she had not asked to witness. And more importantly, someone else out there had a secret that Raven was trying to expose. She retrieved the tiny GPS tracker she had used years ago during her volunteer work with migratory bird research. It still sat in the drawer of her bedroom nightstand, a forgotten relic until now. But tonight it felt like the most crucial tool in her home. She held it for a long moment, feeling its small weight in her palm, imagining what it might lead her to find. She couldn't rely on others to solve this mystery. She would have to follow Raven herself. The thought terrified her. What if she found something she was not prepared to see? What if whatever was hidden in the forest was not yet finished with its work? But the alternative, doing nothing, was worse. It meant allowing horror to continue unchecked. It meant letting someone remain lost and uncounted in the dark. As night wrapped itself around the town, Melissa set the tracker beside the 3 containers. Her decision was made. Tomorrow she would act. Tomorrow she would step beyond the safe boundaries of her grief and fear, following a crow into a truth she could no longer deny. When she finally went to bed, the curtains fluttering slightly in the wind, she imagined Raven perched on the railing, silent and alert, waiting for her to find the courage to follow. It was no longer just a bird. It had become a guide. And she suspected that once she took the first step into the forest, the path ahead would change her life forever. The night stretched on endlessly, full of restless turning and fragmented sleep. Every time Melissa's eyes closed, she saw Raven's shape dissolving into the forest canopy, as though the bird itself were a doorway into something she wasn't meant to witness. By the time dawn began its slow crawl across the sky, exhaustion clung to her like a heavy cloak. yet beneath it pulsed a core of determination she hadn't felt in years. She had spent most of her life taking responsibility, making difficult decisions in sterile clinics under bright lights where everything was predictable and under control. Now, fate was demanding that she rise to the task once more, but this time without the comfort of familiarity. She moved through her morning routine with mechanical intent. Medicine, shoes, jacket zipped against the early chill. Her pulse thrummed steadily, though she could feel the faint weakness in her heart, a worry lingering like an unwelcome companion. She wouldn't let it stop her. Not now. Not after everything Raven had shown her. She prepared herself at the small kitchen table, laying out what she would need like tools on a surgical tray. The GPS tracker came first, small, unobtrusive, with a light casing and a durable band designed to secure around an animal's limb. She had 2 units left from her volunteer days. Both were still functional. She set a thin collar-like strap beside it, the kind created to avoid harming the birds. Just seeing the equipment again pulled her back to memories of long hikes with fellow bird enthusiasts and evenings spent examining migratory routes on a laptop. She'd loved the sense of being part of something meaningful, something that helped protect life. Funny, she thought grimly, how tools meant for preserving nature might soon expose the darkest corruption in human behavior. She spread a handful of seeds into her palm and stepped toward the balcony door. The morning sky was painted in faded hues of blue and violet. The air felt strangely expectant. When she opened the door, the quiet dawn fractured into movement as wings beat the air and Raven descended, landing with precise confidence. The crow's head tilted as if greeting her. Its dark eyes gleamed with recognition and something almost like trust. She spoke softly, not wanting to alarm the bird. Her voice carried a thin edge of anxiety, but Raven didn't flinch. The crow hopped closer, drawn to the familiar sight of food in her hand. Melissa let it begin eating, moving slowly, deliberately, letting the moment stretch long enough for the bird's comfort to override suspicion. With her free hand, she gently brought the GPS strap closer, waiting for the exact second Raven's attention dipped fully into the seeds. It was over in less than a breath. Her fingers secured the tracker around Raven's scaled leg. The crow paused, noticing the new weight, and looked at her again, wings half lifted as if deciding whether to take flight or attack. Melissa's heart lurched, but she held her ground, murmuring in a soothing voice she once used for frightened children in her dental chair. The crow blinked once, adjusted to the unfamiliar sensation, then pecked at a stray seed, deciding it was unimportant. Then, with a rush of feathers, Raven launched into the air, circling once before heading towards the tree line with deliberate intent. Melissa stood frozen for a moment, processing what she had just done. It felt like crossing a threshold. There was no turning back now. She hurried inside and grabbed her phone, opening the tracking app. A small red dot moved across the screen, dancing quickly over the digital map as Raven cut through the morning air. The first stretch matched what she'd observed, over the residential rooftops and toward the western forest. The dot paused periodically, likely when Raven landed, then continued deeper and deeper into green territory. She watched until the signal steadied several miles out, far from any roads or hiking trails she recognized. It was a place where only wildlife or those with sinister motives would wander. A chill prickled along her skin. She swallowed, feeling her throat tighten. It was one thing to follow the path represented on her screen, and quite another to step into the enormous labyrinth of trees and shadows in real life. She thought of how easily a person could be swallowed by such a place, how easily something horrifying could be hidden without anyone knowing. Her heart ached, not from physical weakness but from the old wound of helplessness. She remembered the call from the hospital years ago telling her that her brother, vibrant and stubborn, had died alone before she could say goodbye. She had entrusted his remains to others. She had believed them. And if they had lied, she refused to let that kind of betrayal claim more lives. She printed out a map that showed the approximate coordinates. Her hands shook slightly as she circled the location in red pen. A deep breath steadied her. Next came packing. She gathered a water bottle, a folded rain jacket, a protein bar, a portable charger for her phone, a small first aid kit, and a flashlight she tested twice to ensure it would last. Finally, she took one more look around the apartment that had become a sanctuary and a cage. She wrote a note, short, factual, without the drama that churned in her stomach, and left it on her desk. If anything happens to me, follow the locator app on my phone. It will lead to the truth. She didn't let herself dwell on what that meant. Fear had already taken enough from her life. She would not allow it to steal her courage, too. The town looked deceptively ordinary as she stepped outside. People drove to work, sprinklers watered pristine lawns, and neighbors chatted about the weather without knowing horror might lurk a few miles away. Melissa walked briskly, the backpack pulling lightly against her shoulders, her phone in hand as she followed the moving red dot that was Raven. She exited the residential blocks and found herself at the edge of the long road that led into the forest's outer border. The trees ahead looked almost welcoming from this distance, a wall of green broken by sunlight drifting between leaves. But Melissa knew that beauty could disguise cruelty. She paused for a moment, steadying herself, eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. The road transitioned into a trail, narrow and covered with soft dirt. Each step forward slowed her breathing, though not from physical strain. Every sound, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the call of distant birds, the whisper of branches, seemed amplified, watching her as she passed. She checked the app. Raven was still ahead, moving deeper into the unknown. A few times the signal stopped briefly, meaning the crow had landed, but then resumed its path farther inward. It wasn't long before the forest swallowed the light. Tall pines and thick underbrush created a canopy that absorbed sound and sun alike. The air turned cooler, tinged with the scent of damp earth and decay. Melissa's heart rate picked up, reminding her that her health was still a fragile thing, but she pushed onward, resting only when she absolutely needed to. Sweat gathered along her spine, and her breath came in soft gasps, but she refused to turn back. She passed landmarks she would later struggle to recall. A fallen tree so large she had to climb over it carefully. A patch of scorched earth littered with broken branches that crumbled under her touch. The faint impression of tire tracks in hardened mud where no car should have been able to go. Each discovery fed her growing fear. She wasn't just chasing a strange curiosity. She was stepping toward something orchestrated, something hidden deliberately. Her mind kept circling the same thought. Someone knew this forest well enough to use it. Someone trusted its isolation to keep their secrets safe. The tracker's path began to angle upward, and she realized she was climbing a gentle slope. Rocks replaced soil beneath her feet, slowing her progress. Her legs burned with effort, and she paused often to breathe deeply, pressing a hand to her chest. She checked her phone each time, ensuring the battery life was holding up. The dot blinked steadily at the top of what looked to be a hilly ridge. At last she reached the crest, lungs aching. Below stretched a valley where the trees grew so densely they formed what looked like a solid mass of shadow. Raven's signal hovered near the base of a rocky incline, too remote to be casual. Melissa's nerves vibrated with a mixture of anticipation and dread. She could almost imagine Raven perched somewhere below, waiting for her. She tightened the straps of her backpack and took the first steps down the uneven slope. Loose stones shifted beneath her shoes, sending tiny avalanches skittering downward. Each slip was a reminder that one fall could leave her stranded or worse. But stopping now felt impossible. She had come too far. By the time she reached the flatter ground, moisture clung to her clothes. The air was heavy with something she couldn't quite identify. Smoke, perhaps, tinged with a chemical burn. Her pulse quickened again, and she looked toward the rocks rising sharply nearby. There was no trail now, only instinct and the tracker's guidance. The closer she moved to the rock face, the stronger the sensation that she was trespassing into a place meant to stay forgotten. And then she saw it. Not a cave in the grand cinematic sense, but a narrow fissure in the stone, half hidden by overgrown vines and shrubbery. A person, not looking for it, might walk past without noticing. But the tracker's dot pointed directly there. As she stood before it, the smell intensified, hitting her with a wave of nausea that forced her to turn away briefly. It was not the smell of nature. It was something fouler, unnatural. Her mind, trained to recognize the subtleties of decomposition despite her dental focus, recoiled. That scent belonged where the living did not belong. She backed up a single step, instinct screaming at her to leave. Every primal part of her urged retreat. She should go home now, forget everything. Pretend Raven had never brought her a single tooth. Hand this to someone stronger, younger, better equipped. But then she thought of the police officer's dismissive smile. She thought of her brother, his urn sitting at her windowsill for years, believing she had done well by him. She thought of the teeth that lay silent in their containers, voices of victims who could not speak. Someone had to face this. Someone had to bear witness. Melissa clenched her jaw and stepped towards the fissure. Her body trembled, but her resolve held. She braced her hand against the cool stone wall and inhaled a shaky breath, forcing stale air into her lungs. In that moment, she realized she was no longer simply a retired woman feeding birds. She was the only person willing to follow the truth. And the truth was waiting for her in the darkness ahead. For a long moment, Melissa stood at the threshold of the narrow opening in the rock, the stale air seeping from within, brushing against her face like a warning. Her breath came in shallow pulses, and she felt her heartbeat hammering against her ribs with the urgent rhythm of life, desperate to avoid danger. She reminded herself that she had come too far to retreat now, and too much was at stake to allow cowardice to claim her. She wiped her damp palms on her jeans, took hold of the rough stone edge for balance, and pushed herself sideways into the slit of darkness. The entry was so tight at first that the rock scraped her backpack and jacket, forcing her to twist her body in unnatural angles. The smell intensified with every inch she descended, a mixture of rot, char, and damp soil that clawed at her senses. She clicked her flashlight on, the beam slicing through the gloom like a surgical tool. The cave walls appeared slick and uneven, as though they had been eroded not by time alone, but by human interference. Water dripped rhythmically from somewhere deeper, the sound echoing through the cramped passage. She took her first cautious steps forward, her hand pressed against the stone for stability. The light quivered slightly with the tremble in her hand, and she had to stop to steady herself before continuing. The space widened gradually, allowing her to breathe easier and move more naturally. She paused again to listen. Nothing but the faint trickle of water and the distant flapping of wings, as though the forest above was still breathing despite what lay hidden beneath it. The path sloped downward, becoming a natural ramp. Her shoes slipped once on a patch of moss, and she caught her balance with a gasp, gasping a breath that tasted of mildew and ashes. She wondered how often someone else had walked this same route, how many times men with trucks or carts had trudged into the depths, carrying burdens no one would ever wish to see. The thought made her skin crawl. She kept moving, and each step felt like a betrayal of her own safety. But she forced herself forward, clinging to the belief that truth mattered, even when it was buried in shadows and rot. When she finally reached the point where the cave widened into a larger chamber, the sight before her made her freeze in place. Her light landed on an expanse of objects that initially made no sense in such a natural cavern. Plastic tarps draped over mounds that rose like grotesque boulders from the uneven floor. The tarps were stained in dark hues, their edges curled and melted in places, as though exposed to extreme heat. The smell that had lingered in the entryway exploded into its full horror here. She clamped a hand over her mouth and nose, barely containing the urge to gag. It was the scent of death, persistent, sour, sickening, and it coated the air like a suffocating shroud. Her feet refused to move at first. She stared at the shapes beneath those tarps, her mind pleading with her to stop, to flee before the truth seared itself into her memory forever. But she didn't turn back. She made herself lift the hem of one tarp with trembling fingers, peeling it back just enough to see the nightmare beneath. Beneath that corner lay limbs, too many limbs, jumbled together without care or dignity. Bones charred black in places, fragments of clothing fused to them by fire, patches of tissue clinging stubbornly where flames had not yet consumed. The bodies had been burned, but not fully, not like cremation was supposed to leave them. Her body lurched forward, and she turned away, retching into the dirt. When she finished, she wiped her mouth with shaking fingers and leaned on the nearest rock to steady herself. The bile burned her throat as tears stung her eyes. She blinked through the blur until the world steadied again, knowing she couldn't afford to collapse here. Not when she had already seen enough to confirm that this was a crime scene of a magnitude she never could have imagined. She forced her gaze to the edges of the chamber where discarded items lay scattered. Rusted metal fragments she recognized as coffin handles, partially melted urns, and identification bracelets with numbers and letters half erased by heat. Her flashlight beam traveled over these objects slowly, and each one seemed to scream stories that had been cut off too soon. The scale of what she had found was overwhelming. This was not the work of someone unhinged acting alone. This was systematic, planned, repeated. A hidden mechanism of deception and cruelty operating in the dark of this forest. She reached into her pocket and fumbled for her phone. Her fingers were stiff, almost numb from shock, but she managed to bring the screen to life and dial emergency services. The call connected, and when the dispatcher answered, Melissa's voice shook with urgency, yet clarity cut through her fear. She gave her name, her approximate location, the nature of the discovery. It was only when she was asked whether she was safe that her voice broke. She wasn't sure, but she remained where she was, flashlight in hand, unwilling to abandon what she had found. As she waited for help to arrive, she took cautious steps deeper into the chamber, compelled to gather every detail she could. Her light caught on boxes shoved carelessly into a corner. She approached them slowly. The first box she opened contained assorted metal fragments, quite a few dental prosthetics among them. Bridges, crowns, pieces of dentures. Many of these items were sturdy enough to survive heat, and she recognized some of the brands, even the styles of construction. It hit her then that she wasn't only looking at remains. She was looking at the remnants of entire lives reduced to evidence of fraud and exploitation. On a low table sat a stack of manila folders and printed spreadsheets, their edges curled from moisture but still readable. She pulled one free, flipping it open. Inside were records of cremations, dates, names, services paid for, signatures from loved ones who had entrusted their grief and closure to a business they believed was honorable. Melissa's vision clouded. She pressed a fist against her sternum as a deep pain nestled into her heart. Not physical strain this time, but heartbreak for every family that had come here unwittingly, believing their loss had been treated with dignity. The worse realization struck. Her brother's name might be on one of these pages. Her chest tightened with emotion so raw she staggered backward. The sound of her own sob, muffled by the cavern walls, nearly brought her to her knees. She closed her eyes and reminded herself that she wasn't alone here, not entirely. The bird that had guided her, whether through instinct or something more mysterious, had ensured she would discover this place. Raven had not led her astray. The thought of her feathered companion perched somewhere above, keeping silent vigil, gave her the strength to keep breathing. For what felt like hours, though only minutes may have passed, Melissa stood there, caught between terror and resolve. Then, faint but unmistakable, she heard voices. Distant at first, muddled by echoes, but growing clearer with each passing second. Flashlights bounced against the cave walls before she saw the silhouettes of uniformed officers making their way into the chamber. Relief surged through her so forcefully she leaned against the rock to avoid collapsing. Help had arrived. She was no longer the only witness. The officers' reactions were immediate. Shock, grimness, hasty communication over their radios as they marked the area off and guided Melissa carefully away from the worst of the scene. She clutched her phone to her chest like a lifeline, her hands still shaking uncontrollably. Someone draped a blanket over her shoulders, but she hardly felt the warmth. Her eyes kept drifting back toward the mounds beneath the tarps, knowing she had glimpsed only a fraction of what lay there. This was bigger than she could have ever imagined. It was monstrous. As they escorted her toward the entrance of the cave, she stole one last look behind her. The chamber, lit now by multiple beams of light, revealed its horrors with stark clarity. She thought of the families waiting at home, believing ashes in their possession belonged to loved ones. She thought of the trust that had been violated by people who treated human remains like trash. Her voice cracked when she thanked the officers for coming. One of them assured her she had done the right thing. The words didn't bring comfort, not yet, but she held on to them as a tether to sanity. Outside, daylight hit her like a slap. She blinked against the brightness, disoriented by how normal the world looked despite the nightmare concealed just beneath the Earth's surface. A medic guided her to a bench and began checking her vitals, concern creasing his brow when he felt the rapid, uneven beat of her heart. She nodded to his questions, answering mechanically, though every nerve in her body still seemed anchored inside the cave. In that moment, Melissa understood fully that discovering the truth was only the first step. There would be consequences. investigations. Questions that demanded answers, and beyond the legal implications lay a deeper emotional reckoning. She wasn't just exposing horror, she was unearthing grief that had been stolen from dozens, maybe hundreds of people, including herself. As she stared into the forest, searching the treetops, she spotted a familiar black silhouette. Raven perched silently on a high branch, watching the commotion. Their eyes met briefly, though the bird was too far to see clearly. Still, Melissa felt the connection. That small creature had dragged the truth into daylight, piece by piece. She whispered a thank you, knowing the bird could not understand the words, but believing that somehow it might feel the gratitude behind them. Her hands tightened around the edge of the blanket as the air around her filled with the sounds of investigators moving in and out of the cave. The police would take control now. The world would soon learn just how terrible this place was. She no longer had to walk alone into the dark, but the road ahead would not be easy. The truth had a price. And for Melissa Harper, that price was only beginning to reveal itself. The world outside the cave felt unreal, as though Melissa had crossed some invisible threshold, dividing the known from the unimaginable. Even as medics checked her vitals and officers moved with hurried purpose, she could still sense the cavern yawning behind her like a great mouth swallowing light. Her body trembled with the aftershocks of shock, and though she tried to focus on the voices around her, her mind kept drifting back to the tarps, the limbs, the melted urns, and the overwhelming stench of death that clung to her memory like damp smoke. The forest air should have been cleansing, but every breath she drew seemed tainted by what she had just witnessed. She sat on a bench the officers had dragged over from their vehicles, her legs weak beneath her, and her hands wrapped tightly around the emergency blanket someone had offered. It wasn't the cold she was fighting, but the sense that she might shatter if she let go of anything grounding her to the present moment. As investigators moved equipment toward the cave entrance, she watched them with a numb, detached fascination. They didn't hesitate the way she had. They didn't pause to fight the instinct to flee. They walked directly into the darkness with calm, trained purpose, and she wondered what it must feel like to have that armor of experience, to face horror and not be undone by it. She had spent her career in clean, organized spaces, restoring order to the human body through methodical care. Nothing in her decades of dentistry had prepared her for the grotesque disarray hidden in that chamber. Her work had always been so intimately tied to maintaining dignity. What she found inside that cave was the very opposite, the stripping away of every shred of humanity those victims once had. While she sat there dazed, a detective approached her, introducing himself in a calm and measured tone. She barely caught his name, but his presence steadied her slightly. He crouched down to her level, speaking with the kind of gentleness reserved for victims of trauma. She listened, nodding occasionally, answering questions when needed. She recounted the timeline of events, the exact items Raven had brought her, what she saw inside, and how she had recognized signs of improper cremation. The detective scribbled notes, but Melissa could see in his eyes that he understood the gravity of what had been uncovered. He excused himself eventually, leaving her with the assurance that she had done something extraordinary by coming forward. The words barely sank in. She didn't feel extraordinary. She felt hollow. And beneath that hollowness churned an emotion darker and deeper. Anger. Someone had done this on purpose. Someone had reduced human lives to clandestine waste. Someone had taken advantage of trust so sacred that to violate it was an act approaching sacrilege. Her gaze drifted back to the cave. More officers had arrived now, some carrying stretchers, others equipment she didn't recognize. She watched as a forensic expert in protective suit and mask emerged from the entrance carrying a small metallic item sealed in a bag. More followed, each one stepping into daylight with hands full of grim evidence that would soon be cataloged, analyzed, and used to uncover the truth behind this operation. Melissa felt a strange shift inside her then. The numbness began to thin, replaced by an urgent need to know more. The fear was still present, coiled in her gut, but there was something stronger rising through it. A determination rooted not in curiosity but in duty. These bodies had been robbed not only of proper burial but of justice. The least she could do was bear witness until the end. When the detective returned, he asked whether she felt well enough to accompany him to the command post they were establishing nearby. She nodded, though her legs protested as she stood. The ground felt unsteady beneath her feet, as though the world itself had tilted. He offered her an arm, and she accepted it gratefully. The command area was a cluster of vehicles stationed in a clearing adjacent to the cave, their open trunks exposing supplies, laptops, evidence kits, and radios chattering with clipped voices. A tent had been erected, functioning as a temporary base of operations. Inside the tent, she was given a chair, a bottle of water, and a blanket that smelled faintly of disinfectant. She sipped from the bottle, but the taste of the cave still lingered on her tongue, making it difficult to swallow. She tried to ground herself by observing everything around her. The officers mapping the cave layout on a whiteboard, the analysts murmuring over photographs, the hum of generators powering lights and equipment. It was chaotic, yet purposeful, a stark contrast to the quiet horror concealed beneath the forest floor. As she watched them, something caught her eye. A large evidence bin placed near the table where two forensic technicians were sorting items. Through the clear side panel, she glimpsed a collection of urns. Her breath caught. They were dented, melted in places, their engravings warped by heat. Yet some were still legible enough to reveal names. She felt a cold sweep run through her, starting at her chest and radiating outward. These names belonged to people whose families believed their remains had been handled respectfully. They had buried, scattered, or kept ashes that were lies. Before she could stop herself, she rose from her chair and approached the technicians. Her fingers curled into fists at her sides as she stared at the urns. Some had labels still partially intact: dates, service numbers, cremation certificates. She wanted to reach out, to hold them, to shield them somehow from the indignity they had endured. The technicians noticed her staring and offered sympathetic looks, but they could not offer comfort. They knew what these urns represented. She scanned the names desperately, searching for one in particular, even though she prayed she wouldn't find it. Her brother's last name had not been uncommon, and the thought that his identity might be mixed among those stolen fragments of metal was unbearable. She told herself not to look, that the forensic team would contact her if anything matching his records appeared, but she couldn't turn away. Her eyes moved slowly across the names. Somewhere in the middle of the third line, she froze. Harper. Her knees buckled, and she had to grab the edge of the table to remain standing. The room seemed to tilt. She stared at the distorted letters, unable to breathe. Her name was uncommon enough in the region that coincidence was unlikely. Her brother's service had been processed years ago. She remembered the signature she placed on the paperwork, her pen trembling as she signed off on his cremation, believing she was fulfilling his final wish. She remembered holding the urn the funeral home delivered, light, polished, adorned with a tasteful plaque, and thinking how strange it felt to carry the weight of loss in such a small object. But that urn had been a lie, a counterfeit of grief. She heard someone speaking to her, asking her to sit, but the words were muffled as though drifting through water. She sank into a chair as tears blurred her vision. She felt hands on her shoulders, a gentle voice telling her to breathe. She had processed death before, comforted families, offered condolences, witnessed the sorrow of countless lives touched by loss. But this pain was different. This was no natural passing. This was theft. Her brother's body had been discarded like garbage in a cave where only animals and criminals could find him. The anguish that filled her was sharp and burning. Her heart pounded unevenly, and she pressed a hand to her chest, unsure whether the pain was emotional or physical. She closed her eyes, willing herself to breathe through the trembling that overtook her limbs. Someone handed her another bottle of water, and she sipped mechanically, her thoughts spiraling. She remembered his smile, his boisterous laugh, the way he always tried to cheer her up when medical school felt too overwhelming. She remembered the day she received the call about his accident, the numbness that followed, and the belief that at least she had given him dignity in death. Now that final shred of comfort had been torn away. She hadn't even mourned properly. She had mourned a fabrication. When she opened her eyes again, the grief was still there, but beneath it simmered a rising fire, a quiet, slow-burning fury. This wasn't simply about exposing a crime anymore or saving others from ignorance. This was personal. She would see this through not only for the families but for herself, for her brother, for the dignity he had been denied. She stood again, steadier this time, and asked to see everything they had so far. The detective hesitated, worried she might be pushing herself too hard, but she insisted. He relented, guiding her through the setup. Charts mapped where evidence had been found inside the cave. Photographs displayed items recovered from recent deposits. A timeline was forming, showing how long the operation might have been in place and how many victims it might include. The sheer scale was staggering. Dozens of remains, possibly hundreds over the years. The more she learned, the more horrified she became. But intertwined with that horror was a sense of responsibility she couldn't ignore. She wasn't a detective or a forensic expert, but she understood dental work. She could identify certain types of fillings, estimate ages, notice details that others might overlook, and she realized that her skills could help the investigation significantly. When she offered her assistance, limited of course by her health and the emotional trauma she was processing, the detective's eyes lit with respect. They welcomed any expertise that could help piece together this labyrinth of deceit. She agreed to provide insights when possible, though she warned she needed time. They promised not to push her beyond what she could handle. As the day wore on, more remains were carried from the cave. Each time a stretcher emerged, Melissa felt a pang of sorrow reverberate through her, imagining the weight of each life represented by that shrouded shape. She wondered about the families who would soon receive devastating news, who would learn that the ashes they had loved and mourned over were not their kin. She wondered how many memorials were built on lies. Hours passed before she finally stepped away from the command tent to breathe in the forest air again. Evening light filtered through the treetops, bathing the clearing in gold. She lifted her gaze and spotted Raven perched high above on a branch, gazing down at her with a calm, watchful presence. The bird seemed almost like a guardian, a silent witness to the unfolding truth. It cawed softly, the sound drifting through the leaves like a faint reminder of why she had come here. She whispered softly, her voice breaking. "You led me here." Gratitude welled within her so powerfully it nearly overwhelmed her. Raven blinked slowly before taking flight, its wings cutting through the forest air with quiet grace. Melissa tracked its movement until it vanished behind a canopy of branches. As shadows lengthened, she felt exhaustion settle into her bones. Her body ached, her heart throbbed unevenly, and her mind felt overloaded. But though she was battered, she was not defeated. She knew there was still so much work ahead. She would face it all, even the darkest revelations, because she owed that to those who could no longer speak for themselves. Before leaving the clearing for the night, she turned back for one final look at the cave entrance now surrounded by officers and floodlights. The horror inside had been dragged into the open, and there was no burying that truth again. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew this. The darkness that had consumed those bodies would no longer hide in silence, because she had seen it, because she had survived it, and because she would not stop until justice did too. By the time Melissa returned home that night, the sky had long surrendered to a thick sheet of darkness. Streetlights glowed with a soft amber haze, and each step from the taxi felt heavier than the last, as though a portion of the cave's oppressive weight clung stubbornly to her shoulders. She moved through her apartment on autopilot, closing the door, setting her keys on the table, shrugging out of her jacket, her actions disjointed and mechanical. The quiet inside was suffocating, and the tick of the kitchen clock sounded unbearably loud. She sank into the living room chair and covered her face with both hands, letting the silence wash over her. Only when she lowered her hands did she realize she was trembling again. She caught sight of the 3 containers still sitting where she'd left them, the teeth that had started this nightmare. Her stomach twisted as she stared. They no longer felt like clues. They felt like ghosts, like voices stripped of sound. She reached for them but stopped just before touching the plastic. She didn't want to open even one of them again. She didn't want to look at evidence she understood too well. She had seen enough in the cave to erase any lingering doubt. These teeth came from victims of a terrible, ongoing betrayal. Leaning back, she stared at the balcony. A part of her expected Raven to be there, waiting, its presence somehow grounding in chaos, but the railing was empty, and the trees beyond swayed gently, as if pretending nothing monstrous had ever been hidden in their roots. That absence made her feel more alone than she had all day. Eventually, exhaustion pushed her into bed. She lay awake for a long time, replaying everything as if her mind refused to allow rest until it had cataloged each dreadful detail. When sleep finally came, it was not a refuge, but a realm of twisted memories, flames licking at piles of bones, names melting into ash, her brother calling out from beneath the tarp while she stood helplessly just a few feet away. Nightmares came in waves until she jolted awake at dawn, breathless and clutching her chest, unsure for a brief moment whether she was alive or buried in that cavern. The next morning, she prepared herself to return to the investigation site. She forced down tea, though it barely stayed in her stomach, and dressed carefully, choosing clothes sturdy enough for the forest terrain. On her way out, she paused once more at the balcony, hoping to see Raven. But again, the bird was absent. A prickle of disappointment and worry crept into her mind. She had followed Raven into horror. Perhaps the bird had done what it came to do and would not return. She silently thanked it anyway. When she arrived, the area around the cave had transformed into a hive of activity. Bright floodlights and temporary fencing marked the perimeter. Officers, forensic technicians, and medical personnel moved back and forth, carrying out tasks with practiced precision. Media vans and reporters clustered farther away, corralled behind a barrier to prevent interference. The world had begun to understand the magnitude of what she discovered. As Melissa walked toward the command tent, several officers nodded at her with recognition and solemn respect. The detective from yesterday greeted her and guided her inside. He explained that the initial findings confirmed her suspicions. The bodies showed incomplete cremation, chemical residue inconsistent with proper crematory processes, and multiple pieces of personal jewelry and implants that should have been returned to loved ones. They were piecing together timelines to determine how long the scheme had been active. Already, at least a decade appeared likely. Melissa listened, absorbing each fact like a blow. The operation had robbed countless people of the closure they deserved. It had desecrated the dead and exploited grief for financial gain. And she had unwittingly participated years ago by trusting the same facility with her brother's remains. The detective then told her something else. Investigators had confirmed that the crematorium she used was indeed the primary suspect. The owners had been brought in for questioning early that morning. They denied everything at first, claiming sabotage or mistake, but evidence was accumulating quickly. False paperwork, financial inconsistencies, and witness statements were emerging. There was no doubt a criminal empire had been operating beneath the guise of care. Melissa felt a mixture of vindication and sorrow. Justice was happening, but justice could not restore dignity already stolen. Later that afternoon, she was escorted deeper into the investigation area where identification specialists worked. The sight made her pulse quicken. Dozens of tables set up under tents, each holding remains, ashes, or labeled containers. Teams cataloged details, attempting to match every bone, every object, to a missing person or a cremation service listed in the recovered documents. Families across the region would soon receive calls that would reopen grief they thought buried. Melissa lingered near the station where dental evidence was being analyzed. A woman in forensic scrubs was reviewing an assortment of teeth and implants laid out on sterilized trays. When Melissa quietly introduced herself as a retired dentist offering assistance, the woman's expression shifted with deep gratitude. They talked for several minutes about how dental structures could offer reliable identification even without DNA, fillings unique in shape, bridges tied to specific dental practices, and certain crown styles linked to particular time periods. Reluctantly, Melissa agreed to help evaluate what she could. Though the responsibility weighed heavy, she knew it might bring answers faster. The first object she examined was a metal dental bridge fused with char and soot. She analyzed the design, the type of alloy used, the placement of the pontics. Her years of expertise stirred awake, guiding her mind into clinical focus. For a moment, the horror faded, replaced by professionalism. It reminded her that she had something meaningful to contribute, something that no one else there could do quite the same. But that brief reprieve collapsed the moment the technician handed her the file with the name that was now carved into her heart. Harper. She braced herself as she reviewed the details. Her brother's case number, the date, a prosthetic pattern she recognized instantly. She could feel her composure crumbling, her chest tightening with a familiar ache that brought tears to her eyes. Her brother was there. Confirmed. Trapped for years in a dark tomb of indignity. Her grief surged outward in a silent scream, but she held it down through sheer force of will. She breathed, slow and long, until she could speak again without her voice breaking. The technician touched her shoulder softly and offered condolences. Melissa nodded, unable to find words. She'd come here to help others, but deep down she needed to help him too, to atone for a mistake she had never known she made. As the day progressed, Melissa gave statement after statement to investigators, prosecutors, and state authorities who had now arrived. She remained steadfast, but each question extracted a little more from her already aching heart. She found herself glancing at the forest every so often, hoping to see Raven perched somewhere nearby, but the crow never appeared. She wondered whether it had sensed that its mission was complete, or whether it too was recoiling from the horrors it had uncovered. By evening, when they finally allowed her to leave, the exhaustion was overwhelming. The detective arranged for a patrol car to drive her home. The ride was quiet, and she stared out the window, watching trees slip past like silent sentinels guarding their terrible secrets. At home, she lowered herself into her favorite chair and let the stillness embrace her. The silence no longer felt empty. It was full of unspoken truths. She poured herself a cup of tea she knew she wouldn't drink and sat in the lamplight, staring at the wall as though answers might appear there. Her thoughts churned relentlessly. Her brother would finally have a proper resting place. The families would finally learn what became of their loved ones. The crematorium owners would face consequences for their cruelty, and she, once powerless and ignored, had become the catalyst for justice. But none of it brought relief. She wasn't done. She couldn't be. Justice required seeing this through to the very end. Her eyes drifted toward the balcony one more time. The railing remained empty, but a soft gust of air stirred the curtain and carried the faintest sound of wings flapping somewhere above. Melissa drew in a slow breath. Raven had not abandoned her. It had trusted her to finish what the bird could only begin. Even if the path ahead was paved with pain, she would follow it. For her brother, for every stolen life, and for herself, so she could one day look back and know she never chose the easier road at the price of the truth. The following weeks unfolded slowly, like pages turned in a heavy book where every word was written in grief. Sirens and reporters faded from the forest as the investigation shifted into offices, laboratories, and courtrooms. Yet, the weight of what had been discovered remained as palpable as ever. Melissa spent many days attending follow-up interviews, signing statements, identifying recovered dental structures, and speaking to authorities who now treated her not as a fragile retiree, but as a crucial witness and expert. The transformation was strange and bittersweet. She had not asked for any of this. She had only wanted to understand why a crow had brought her a tooth. Now she was helping unravel one of the most disturbing crimes her town had ever known. Grief and purpose wove together inside her, making sleep elusive and meals tasteless. She often found herself standing at the window late at night, staring at the dark line of trees silhouetted by moonlight. She would think of the bodies carried from beneath those roots, of the families who would receive calls explaining that the ashes they had cried over belonged to no one at all. Sometimes she whispered apologies into the quiet air, knowing they would never be enough. But she whispered them anyway, because silence felt too much like abandonment. Her brother's remains had finally been identified through a combination of dental analysis and corroborating documents recovered from the cave. Hearing the confirmation was like reopening a wound that had only barely begun to heal. She cried for hours after the detective delivered the news, letting grief rack her entire body until exhaustion claimed her once more. But when she woke, and every day thereafter she felt a growing calm beneath the pain. At least now she knew the truth. At least now she could give him the dignity he had been denied. A small service was arranged just a few miles from the home they once shared as children. It was simple, quiet, attended by only a handful of people. A neighbor who remembered him fondly, a colleague who had stayed in touch, and the detective who thought she shouldn't have to stand alone. The sky that day was overcast, heavy with soft gray clouds. Melissa wore a modest black dress and clutched a folded letter she had written the night before, though she wasn't sure she would be able to read it aloud. When the moment arrived, she stood before the casket, fingers trembling around the paper, and simply let the words spill out in a voice weighted with love and regret. She spoke of their childhood adventures, climbing trees and racing bikes down steep hills. She spoke of his stubborn optimism, how he always believed any wound could heal with time. She spoke of her guilt for never questioning what she had been given, for accepting an urn that had contained nothing of him. She promised him that he would never again be forgotten or discarded like something inconvenient. When she finished, she pressed her hand against the wood of the casket, as if hoping to transfer everything she felt into a space where he might sense it somehow. The funeral workers lowered him gently into the ground, and as dirt whispered onto the lid, Melissa breathed out a long-held ache. He was finally home. When the others began to step away, she lingered. She felt something shift inside her, grief settling into a new shape, less jagged than before. She looked up when she heard a soft rustling in the nearby trees. There, perched on a branch overlooking the grave, sat Raven. The bird's presence struck her like a silent blessing. Raven did not caw or move. It simply watched, solemn and still, as if standing guard. Melissa felt tears fill her eyes again, but this time they were warm rather than scalding. She whispered a thank you, the words barely audible. Raven blinked slowly, then took flight, circling once above the clearing before disappearing into the forest. It was enough. Life did not return to normal after that. It reshaped itself entirely. Melissa began to volunteer her time with advocacy groups, helping families navigate the legal and emotional labyrinth that followed such revelations. She spent long hours speaking with grieving people who were now forced to relive their loss anew. She listened carefully, holding their stories with the same respect she once held her patients' fears. When needed, she offered her dental expertise to help with identifications, though each evaluation cost her a small piece of her heart. But she endured because she knew her work brought others closer to closure. People in the community treated her differently now. Some regarded her with gratitude, others with awe that made her uncomfortable. A few seemed intimidated, as though she were a bearer of dark omens rather than a woman who simply refused to look away. She did her best to accept their thanks with humility, reminding them that she had not acted alone. A crow had delivered the first clue. Fate, or perhaps justice itself, had delivered the rest. Months passed, and autumn crept into the trees with its blazing reds and golds. Melissa found a quiet strength growing in her, a renewed sense of purpose threading into the fabric of each day. She began spending time back on her balcony each morning, scattering seeds out of habit. Sometimes smaller birds came to feast. But Raven did not return often. The bird visited occasionally, always silently, always watching. And each time it appeared, Melissa felt grounded again, as though reminded of her duty, not just to the dead, but to the living who still needed someone to fight for the truth. One crisp afternoon, Melissa walked to the cemetery carrying a small wooden box. Inside, cushioned gently, lay the first tooth Raven had brought her. It had been cleaned and preserved as evidence, but now the case was closed and authorities had given her permission to keep it. She approached her brother's grave slowly, feeling both the chill of the season and the warmth of resolve. The tombstone looked peaceful beneath a canopy of amber leaves. Kneeling, she placed the box beside the headstone and pressed her palm to the grass. "This was the first step," she whispered softly. "You guided me, even when I didn't know it was you. So now, let this rest with you." She lifted her gaze to the sky. Raven was there, high upon a nearby branch as though summoned without a sound. Melissa smiled, a soft, weary curve of lips that held hope rather than despair. Raven tilted its head, then let out a low, resonant caw that echoed through the quiet grounds before spreading its wings. Black feathers carved through the air as the crow sailed upward, light catching its silhouette until it vanished into the blue. Melissa stood slowly, her joints stiff but her spirit steady. The air smelled of earth and fallen leaves. She felt the weight inside her finally lift, replaced by the certainty that everything she had endured, the horror, the sorrow, the relentless pursuit of truth, had led here to this moment where grief and peace could coexist without tearing her apart. She walked home with unhurried steps, knowing her life would never return to what it once was. But she no longer mourned that loss. She had purpose now, not found in a clinic or a title, but in the simple, powerful conviction that dignity must be defended, even for those who can no longer ask for it. As she reached her apartment, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in soft hues of lavender and gold. Melissa paused at her balcony, breathing in the evening air. She understood something profound, that sometimes the darkest truths are brought into the light by the most unexpected messengers, and sometimes justice takes flight long before the law catches up. She stepped inside, closing the door gently behind her, feeling the ember of hope burning quietly in her chest. Tomorrow, more families would have answers. Tomorrow, her brother's memory would be honored as it should have been from the beginning. Tomorrow, she would keep going, because truth, once found, demands to be carried forward. And she would carry it for the lost, for the broken, and for herself, until every last shadow was given light. If this story shocked you, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next unbelievable discoveries. Watch our other videos for more hidden secrets and mysteries that will leave you speechless. Share this video and let others see what lurks just beneath the surface. You won't believe what's real.